Thank you, Grand Chancellor, Madam President, Your Eminence, dear Minister, dear friends. This is a highly timely discussion on migration and international security. I also appreciate the fact that you included in the title of this workshop the term perceptions matter. Yes, perceptions do matter, because this is one of the lessons we learned since taking over these responsibilities within the Commission. Public opinion on migration is incredibly fickle. To take a European example, during the refugee crisis of 2015-16, we first saw a huge wave of public support for welcoming refugees, which was followed by a sharp backlash, at times creating a truly hostile environment for migrants, and even the emergence of cleavages in society that translated into political forces and so on and so forth. And these perceptions matter we also saw recently when we witnessed the blatant attempts to weaponize migrants for political purposes in a novel form of hybrid threat, seeking to destabilize the European Union by orchestrating migratory pressure at our external border. Sadly, it seems that the more salient the issue of migration is in politics and the media, the more divisive it becomes. But this does not have to be like this. Migration is not a short-lived trend. Quite the opposite. Migration was, is, and will continue to be an integral part of human life. It is also what sustains and builds economies, what enriches cultures. It is a source of development and prosperity. And when we discuss migration and international security, our starting point should be precisely that this is an everyday issue that has to be managed. Yet it is true that the continuous displacement of people across the globe reflects a broader global picture of heightened human mobility, one that is more often than not driven by war, instability, and severe human rights violations, and long-standing crises and major devastating conflicts in countries like Afghanistan, Syria, Somalia, Iraq, Libya, Yemen, and South Sudan have emerged or reignited in the recent years. And one thing is clear, that there is still a great deal to be done to address these worrying trends. And let me quickly take you through the European perspective of how we are engaged in finding solutions to the problem. In Europe, the experience of the past 7 years since the major 2015 crisis has taught us mainly two key lessons. First, that migration and asylum is not a question that any member state can answer alone. Big or small, north or south, east or west, effective solutions demand concerted efforts from all sides. And these are only possible when we act as Team Europe and we work towards shared objectives. When we are all able to move past the isolationist rhetorics, which confines the migration narrative to us versus them binary choice. And when we strive to find holistic, cohesive solutions. And this is precisely the logic between our proposal presented in September 2020 for a global new EU Pact for Migration and Asylum. Second lesson to be drawn is that in designing a common European migration and asylum system, the external dimension cannot be an afterthought or merely an auxiliary element. We will never be able to manage internally migration in the European Union unless we find ways to manage externally too. We have starting to put these lessons into practice. And we are now pursuing mutually beneficial, comprehensive, balanced, and tailor-made migration partnerships with countries both at our borders and beyond, recognizing the commonality of challenges and objectives we share. The European Union is the leading international donor in addressing situations of forced displacement. Contrary to the crisis of 2015, when we had to retrofit spending to cope with migration, now our external financing instruments have been designed ex ante to take into consideration migration considerations from the outset, ensuring a more flexible and strategic use of the programming of our external funding, with 10% of the overall spending, around 8 billion, specifically designated to migration-related actions. And on top of this, we have been tirelessly building effective cooperation with countries of origin and transit close to our borders, but also in more distant Asian and African countries, in joining up efforts against smugglers. We are proposing anti-smuggling operational partnerships to reinforce law enforcement capacities and break the exploitative business model of the smugglers, which often supports other illicit activities, fueling contacts and instability. And I salute the presence of my friend, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Iraq, who has been a constant partner in this joint struggle. More than funding, we also now deploying a series of new innovative tools at our disposal that would support the external dimension of the Pact on Migration and Asylum. These include a reinforced role for EU agencies like the European Asylum Agency and Frontex. This involves a more effective framework for returns to ensure that procedures are respected and work in practice. And the annual assessment of third countries' cooperation on readmission under the new visa code gives us precisely the opportunity to take stock, have a frank conversation with partners, and propose concrete visa measures to incentivize cooperation when necessary. Finally, in the field of legal migration, we are working towards agreements on talent partnerships. These talent partnerships agreements with third countries will significantly scale up current pilot projects, which have shown that we as Union can successfully support member states in implementing legal migration schemes. And we will also, in just over a month's time, be coming forward with a series of concrete proposals to better frame legal migration policies at European level. Looking at the broader picture, we are well aware that a truly sustainable long-term response requires us to invest meaningfully and significantly in tackling the root causes of migration, addressing security challenges, supporting solid institutions and good governance, addressing economic opportunities, and with schemes like the Global Gateway, our global EU investment strategy, we, member states and EU institutions, jointly seek to mobilize up to 300 billion euros of investments based on values like transparency, sustainability, good governance, and concern for the welfare of our people. We are investing in strategic infrastructure in areas such as digital, climate and energy, transport, health, education, and research, seeking to build more resilient economies that allow people to have better lives in their countries rather than putting their lives in the hands of the smugglers. Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, I meant it when I said that Europe cannot deal with this challenge alone. Migration is a global issue and therefore requires a global response. The effective and timely cooperation of the international community in helping put a stop to the unscrupulous instrumentalization of human lives by the Lukashenko regime in Belarus was an emblematic core example of a European success story and how we could orchestrate, organize, and cooperate a global response that was necessary. In the midst of the crisis, I personally traveled to 7 key countries of origin and transit, where I was met with utmost willingness to work together with the European Union. It was a moment when Europe was counting our friends, and we were delighted to have found so many. As a result, many of the air routes bringing desperate people to Belarus have been closed and thousands of migrants repatriated, and many of the smuggling networks stopped. The framing of these trips was very important, and they came against the backdrop of sanctions from the European Union, the United States, and the United Kingdom against Belarus. So this was a message, a strong message, that the international community can and will work together. Now, the events unfolding in Ukraine as we speak also pose a major challenge. Should the situation deteriorate, we will be required to surpass those efforts. And beyond a robust set of sanctions that the EU, in coordination with international partners, will be ready to impose, we need to be prepared to face the humanitarian consequences of a potential conflict. Firstly, we would need to replace, to replicate the significant efforts undertaken to evacuate EU nationals and Afghani staff working in the EU institutions as we did during the Afghanistan crisis. And there are currently 2,000 EU nationals living in Ukraine, as well as a sizable community with EU origins that may need support. We are also ready to mobilize significant humanitarian aid as well as civil protection support. With a considerable refugee population already present in Ukraine, we also have to guard against the potential weaponization of migrants, as we saw recently in Belarus. And in this context, there should be no underestimation of the firmness with which the European Union and our member states are prepared to react. Last but not least, our contingency planning must also cater for the security of gas supplies and cybersecurity. And we have already created a task force for this and activated the Cyclone network to prepare for various scenarios. Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, thank you for this opportunity to share my thoughts on this incredibly timely and crucial topic, migration and international security, of which I have many more, but as I usually have already been too lengthy in my remarks. If there is one final message I could leave you with, it would be that efforts to address global migration challenges will fail if not built in solid international cooperation. Yes, perceptions do matter, but when it comes to migration, self-perception is also of great importance. And so far, Europe has always managed to be on the right side of history of this topic, as we had many occasions to see also from our international partners and friends. And it is my solemn belief that we can and must continue to engage in this direction, and nowhere more so than in responding to dramatic events unfolding at our own borders in a country that will always remain at heart and in spirit, as is Ukraine. Thank you very much, and the organizers are now asking me to call Madam Sandu, the President of Moldova, to the stand. Thank you.
Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, I thank you for the opportunity to speak at this event on a topic which is to us both pressing and difficult to approach. Democracy, good governance means better security. Respectively, corruption, poverty, weak democracies can easily become a steady source of insecurity, both for the world, but also for the citizens of these countries. It's a vicious cycle. Corruption, bad governance, injustice determine active people to leave their countries in search for a better future. Many of those who leave are young, energetic people, creative, those who believe in democracy, those who believe in the human rights. These are people who are the core of the economic development and innovation processes in the country. Without them, it's very difficult to strengthen democracy. Without them, it's very difficult to build strong economies. Moldova has the fastest depopulation rate among all the countries in Europe, and the main reason for that is immigration. This has started back after independence, when the prolonged transition, the hardship of the transition, determined many people to start leaving the country, trying to find their way to provide for their families. Today, 30 years after independence, 1/3 of the population is living and working abroad. Immigration is the biggest issue my country is facing, and the biggest challenge that we have now as a governance is to make people believe again in their country, is to convince young people to stay and hopefully to convince many of those who left to return to Moldova. Initially, people left because of poverty, and poverty, of course, is a result of corruption, because people didn't have jobs or the salaries were very small. But then people started to leave even when they had good jobs, good salaries, because of the poor quality of education, because of the poor quality of health, because of the poor business environment, because they could see that the taxes they are paying are not used to improve the quality of the public services, but are being stolen by corrupt people in power. According to the recent poll, 1 in 3 people under the age of 30 and 1 in 5 aged between 30 and 44 are thinking to leave the country. Initially, most Moldovans would immigrate illegally, which has created significant risks for human trafficking. This also meant people could not travel to see their relatives for many years, their families. Children were left with their grandparents and sometimes with siblings of age 12 to 15. And because of the illegal status of these migrants, some of the people, some of the parents couldn't see their children for 3, 5, or even 7 years. You can imagine what are the consequences of this generation of children and what are the social consequences of the migration for the country. Today, many Moldovan citizens have the opportunity to travel and work abroad legally, most of them using their second citizenship, the Romanian citizenship. This phenomenon, with all its consequences, weakens the capacity of the state and causes a number of significant issues. First of all, the labor market faces shortages of workforce. State and private institutions lose qualified employees, and I can share with you the current problem that we're facing when we have a government in power which wants to implement reforms, but which does not find enough competent and honest people who could be employed in the state institutions, because over the years, many of these people have left the country. And this is equally true for the private sector. Every field of and service, both in the private and public sectors, suffers. We have difficult questions to answer, because even when we're trying to improve the quality of our education sector, and we're trying to better train our teachers, our health workers, because of significant difference in the salaries, we find these people, the specialists, leaving the country. Our medical workers are going to Romania, our education specialists are living to Italy and to many other European countries. So what do? Do we invest more in education, knowing that we are losing these people? Of course we have to invest more, but how do we make the change to have quickly enough competitive salaries. And this is not just about education, this is also about the private sector, which has to compete with higher salaries in the neighborhood. Still, remittances have been the main poverty coping mechanism for Moldova. Moldovan citizens who live abroad send money home to support their families and maintain a close contact with their country. At some point, during some periods of times, the remittances accounted for 30% of GDP. Today, this is probably 1/4 of GDP, and this has significant contribution to the people's incomes and to some extent to the development of the country. There have been changes in the structure of migration in the past. Half of the people would go and work in Russia and half would go and work in the European and other countries. Today, most of the remittances come from the European countries and only 12% come from the people who work in Russia. Many Moldovans actively campaign and vote in national elections, and this is what I meant when I said that those who believe in democracy are the first to leave the country. I just want to give you the latest figures from the previous elections. In the presidential election in 2020, which I won, the diaspora vote accounted for 16% of the total vote. And I won 92% of this vote, of the diaspora vote. This means these are people who believe in democracy. And this is how they help us save the democracy in Moldova. But this can also tell you how many people have left the country, people who could put pressure for better governance, people who could demand democracy, people who could contribute in the state institutions to strengthen the democratic processes and the democratic institutions. Of course, we're very lucky that these people care about their country, that they take the time to stay in lines at the Moldovan embassies, to stay for 3, 4, or sometimes even 6 hours, to travel hundreds of kilometers to be able to vote. And this also encourages us because in addition to the fact that they care about their relatives who are still in Moldova, we believe that many of them still see their future in Moldova, and they want to see the changes for good in Moldova, for better, and that's why they are participating in the electoral processes, in the democratic life of the country. The government, of course, is trying to have targeted policies to attract the people who left. So we have programs which would stimulate the returning, the investment, co-financing the investment from the diaspora. I've been doing myself a lot of work in trying to convince people to come back, the Prime Minister, members of the Parliament. We've been contacting people and trying to convince them to return. But it's clear that people want to see more tangible results before they will make such an important decisions. Because in Moldova, they've seen many examples of attempts to improve the situation and then the situation worsening. So here, the biggest issue is, of course, corruption. People have left, people have been disappointed by the fact that we had too many corrupt regimes in Moldova, we had too many big corruption schemes, and this is what drives people away. That's why fighting corruption, reforming justice is one of the biggest priorities for us. This is why people voted for us. It's a difficult reform to undertake because when you have corruption for 30 years, when you have corrupt politicians buying judges and prosecutors, it's not that you can clean up the system over the night. It's not that you can provide for this justice very quickly. But no matter how difficult it is, we're going to continue the reforms, and of course we count on international support because most of the big crooks who participated in huge corruption schemes in Moldova left the country, and some of them are hiding in countries with strong democracies, in countries with strong institutions. They have their money stored in accounts or they bought assets in these countries, And of course, we do need the support of the international organizations and of our bilateral partners to bring these people to justice, and especially to return the money to the people of Moldova. There are many things that we need to do to make the situation good enough for our young people to decide to stay at home, and especially to convince those who have left the country to return. But these are not easy tasks, and we cannot deal with these issues alone. We have the support of our partners, we have the support of the EU institutions, and I was glad to hear Vice President thoughts about migration in the European Union. The EU is Moldova's most important economic partner. The EU is a very important partner when it comes to strengthening democracy and creating economic opportunities, making the country more attractive to its own citizens. And we've been relying on your support, and we will continue to rely on your support. Migration is an issue that spans beyond borders and cannot be tackled by individual states alone. There are no simple solutions and that we can apply to fix this. For my country, the only solution is to continue to work tirelessly every day to improve the lives of people in the country, to provide them with a sense of security and justice, improve the infrastructure, improve the quality of public services, have a good business environment, friendly business environment, and provide assurance that people's businesses are not going to be stalled by corrupt politicians, and of course improve the competitiveness of our economy and be able to create jobs for everybody. By making countries like Moldova able to provide to their citizens a sustainable future at home, we generate stability and security around the world. We contribute to our common good as a planet. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. Okay, so it gives me a great pleasure to be moderating our conversation. While we have great panelists here, we're keen for this to be a conversation where we will ask you to also contribute with your thoughts, your questions, and suggestions. My name is Mina Al-Arabi. I'm the editor-in-chief of The National, which is based in Abu Dhabi. I am Iraqi, and it's a delight to have my foreign minister here. We also have His Excellency, the Foreign Minister of Yemen, who is a beneficiary of migration in a positive sense, who spent some time in Iraq and studied in Iraq. So I was also born in Sweden, and I have been a beneficiary of migration. So I think sometimes as we talk about these issues, to look at all the opportunities migration gives us, but clearly there are security concerns and issues that need to be taken into account, both at the point of transit and the push factors that are pushing people to leave, but also what happens after they have spent some time. We were having a conversation previously saying that sometimes we look at statistics. So according to the statistics, only 3.6% of the world's population are migrants. But in reality, in certain countries, a migrant is looked upon even if they have spent 20, 30, 40 years in a particular country. So there are also societal issues, and to take the point of perceptions. So to have this conversation here on the panel with me is Archbishop Paul Gallagher, Secretary of Relations with States for the Holy See, and Antonia Marie Di Meo, Director of the UN Interregional Crime and Justice Research Institute, and of course, the Grand Chancellor. So I would like to start this conversation by coming to you, Ms. Di Meo, because we want to talk about the issue of security and how to maintain open borders while the consistent concerns regarding security are there.
Great, thank you so much, and it's really an honor to be on this panel. Of course, UNICRI is the UN...
Can I trouble you to use your mic?
I'm a lawyer, I get used to sort of talking without microphones. Thank you so much, it's really an honor to be here. UNICRI is the UN Research and Training Institute that focuses on criminal justice and crime prevention. So security is front and center to what we do. We're also very interested in what the data says And so we've been engaged in some really in-depth research looking particularly at this issue, and we recently published a report that looked at the movement of people, and I'm specifically saying movement of people because I find even the word migration has all these perceptions attached to it. The movement of people into Europe and the impact or interplay with that on terrorism. Now the findings are sort of interesting. First of all, there is no systemic connection. So if you think there is, that's not correct. We find that indeed in recent years there has been 1/5 of terrorist acts were conducted by people who were first generation. But there's very insignificant data on that. So we need to be looking much more closely into what the factors are that actually drive people. One of the findings of our research was that we have to look very carefully at what happens when a person arrives in country. Migration management and the way they are received is absolutely critical, and a lot more needs to be invested in that area, both in terms of resources, but also in terms of infrastructure. And I'll let my other distinguished colleagues speak from the social perspective, but from the security and the criminal justice perspective, if you don't treat them correctly when they come into the country and they're not received properly and they're not integrated properly, it's actually a push factor towards extremism. So that's something that creates more insecurity. That's why we need to be investing this money up front and the time and the effort to really properly integrate people into society and to treat them well. And I'll also mention that, of course, you have various spectrum, people who enter legally, people who enter irregularly, all sorts of spectrum. The people who are stuck in legal limbo, you know, maybe you overstayed a visa or there's been a decision that you're challenging, all these sorts of convoluted processes that come into play. This is also a factor that will create more insecurity and will be a push factor towards insecurity. So paying a lot of attention to what happens with migration management and receiving people is a really important factor of our research. There's more, but I'm going to stop there and look to see how the conversation develops. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So the point that you make about how people are received, and of course we've seen in the recent history this issue of differences between societies. And here, Archbishop Gallagher, I want to turn to you. Because displacement and refugee flows that are created from conflicts have a certain dynamic that's different, for example, than migration where people are seeking better jobs and opportunities and so forth. But at the end of the day, what interventions are necessary and where can religion play a part and faith to bring people together in societies that become very heterogeneous?
Well, thank you, and I'm very happy to participate in this panel this morning, and I welcome the invitation from the Order of Malta. Religion, contrary to what a lot of people think in the West and in Europe, is a very significant part of the lives of the vast majority of people in the world. So their options, our choices, what we do is very much conditioned by our faith, our religion, and therefore also by the perspectives, the perceptions that we have. And I think this is where we have to begin with number one. It is very easy for religious people, it's very easy for religious leaders, as it is for politicians as well, to project good ideas and appropriate ways of behaving. But sometimes we have to recognize it's very difficult to put those things into practice. I find this where I live in Rome all the time. We are very committed to the well-being of migrants and people. But how do you react to the guys on the streets and the people you meet? You don't always react positively. So I think that we have to be very realistic, and we have to be very positive. And we have to say that the change in the perceptions within our society depend upon us, depend upon me. I've recently come back from a visit to the Lebanon, where there is a huge, huge displaced Syrian question. It weighs on the society very heavily. The political leadership would say, and I think many of the religious leaders as well, retain that the situation is unsustainable. So we have to look for things there. But in fact, we have to also say that in many, many societies that are required to welcome very large numbers of refugees and migrants, the reaction of people is very positive. And I think that that is something we have to sort of counter the negative information that people really resent migrants. They push back on migration. An awful lot of people really do see these people in a very positive, and people want to be compassionate to the migrant. After all, one of the traditions within Judeo-Christianity is that migration is a phenomenon that existed forever, and as far as the teaching of the Bible will always exist. Many, many times you hear indications, instructions being given to the chosen people, and then in the times of Christ and the disciples, look after the stranger, the person in your midst. And this was taken for granted. These people will always be there. And so, again, I think that it's something we have to face up to in a very positive way. But I think the contribution of religious leaders and faith communities can be enormous. And it can be also very good in... But the final thing, one thing I would like to say, I very much appreciated what Madam President of Moldova said concerning the loss to the countries. One of the things we see now in places like Lebanon and Syria is that many of the young, many of the most talented are leaving or who have already left with the prospect of not returning. This is creating many more problems, I think. So I think that there is an obligation as well to try and work actively with these countries to help their people to stay. The Pope very often talks about the right to migrate and the right not to migrate as well. And many people, I think, we tend to think that people are running away from their country because they don't like their country anymore, or they don't like what's going on. There may be particular choices that people are making, but most people cherish the land in which they're born, with all its shortcomings. And therefore, I think we as the international community have to really work hard with governments and with leaders to really create circumstances in which people are much less likely to want to migrate and wish to contribute to the well-being of their society. And I think in that sense, religious people, because religion anchors people in a country, in a community, with your own people. And therefore, I think that religion is something which has to be drawn on, which has to be celebrated, which has to be lived to enable people to have a really full sort of experience of life where they are. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Archbishop. You made an interesting point, several points, but the point you said about the place that religion has people's, the place of religion in people's private lives, and that often that doesn't come to the public sphere, especially, I would say, to some extent in Europe. And so, Grand Chancellor, I want to ask you specifically about Europe, and we've heard about the European experience, both in terms of receiving migrants, but also in certain countries where people are leaving. And so that creating societal cohesion, while at the same time respecting that often people's private lives are very different from their public lives. And so what role not only religion, but also what governments can do to kind of overcome some of these perception biases, especially where you have negative context for migrants. And if I can ask you to please use the mic. The microphone, sorry. Yeah, thank you.
There are many aspects on this. Firstly, how do we deal with those who come? In the peak of the migration crisis, 2015-2016, we have run more than 90 reception centers in Germany. In none of them we had major problems. In none of them. Small criminalities, but nothing to talk about. Because we tried to deal with these people in a dignified way. And I tell you a small story. Stories sometimes tell more. Here in Munich, I had a meeting with the Order of Malta, then a break of 2 hours and another meeting. And I needed a haircut. So I went without reservation to a shop to have a haircut. It was full, and I turned to go out. And suddenly, a lady from Africa put her hand on my shoulder and said, "Come, I have a place for you." I said, "How comes? I saw your sign. You treated me so well in the welcome center. I give you a haircut." So these people, after a short while, contribute to society. While if we do not care for those who come, if we leave them in the street, we create security problems. We will have segregated parts of society which are prone to criminality and create many other problems, also health problems. We run a lot of clinics for illegal people where we have kind of unwritten agreements that the police will not go around to arrest these people just for public health reasons. Because if these people will not be treated, they create a problem for public health. And in the pandemia, I think it's obvious to everybody. So we have a saying in Germany, how you shout into the forest, the echo comes back. So first, we have to treat everybody in a dignified way, whether legal, illegal, no matter how he came. And if we look at the figures of those who are sent away again to their origin countries, in spite of all declarations of intentions to send people back, the number is very low. So the people who have arrived will probably stay. And we have to take this as a fact. And just a short further remark, I think it doesn't end with the first generation. We have to deal with the second and third generation too. We don't have to lose contact with them. And allow me another remark. I think in spite of all the efforts of the European Union, I think the signals going to the countries of origin are very dispersed. And because there is no unified signal coming from the European countries, which plays into the cards of the traffickers. And as long as we have not a unified message, which should include more opportunities for legal migration, I think any effort to fight against the criminal trafficking will not succeed.
Thank you very much. Mr. Mayor, I feel like you wanted to remark, so I want to give you the opportunity to just come in, and then we'll open the floor and see if there are remarks or questions from the floor.
Thank you. I will make a couple of remarks. First of all, the point that was made about the public narratives, our research shows that the negative public narratives against migrants actually, again, is a push factor towards extremism. So again, not only from the social perspective, but also if you're interested in security, it's very important for governments to be countering that negative narrative against migration, because you do not want to be encouraging people to move into extremism. The other point that I want to make, among many, is touching upon the perspective of criminality. You cannot, and of course this is what he was saying, you cannot equate migration with criminality. The research does not show that. You do not have higher rates of criminality among migrants. But from a totally different perspective, I previously worked in Libya, looking at human rights issues in Libya. And what we see when we look at the issue of human trafficking is that some of the people that are moving are being used as tools for organized crime. And when you are talking about migration and not actually looking at the systemic manner in which they are moving, and you're not labeling it correctly, you'll never understand what's actually going on. Now, this is not everywhere. Of course, it's not everywhere. But in a situation like what's happening in Libya, where you have conflict, where you have armed groups, make no mistake that the people are being used to fuel the conflict. And you have to look at a criminal justice perspective in analyzing what's going on. That is not just migration. It's much more than migration. And so looking at these nuanced approaches and taking a criminal justice lens to this very complex issue, both the movement side of it and also what happens when people arrive, is extremely important. And again, I'm going to kind of end with the fact that we really have to be making decisions based on data and going into all of these nuances, looking at the context, looking at the specific circumstances and how people are moving to really be able to make informed policies that are going to improve the situation for everyone.
Thank you very much. I mean, we could have a whole other political discussion about how there are certain politicians that take advantage of that and specifically don't want to use the data. Archbishop, I just want to turn to you because 2 points that were raised by the Grand Chancellor and Mr. Maia, which is about coordination and the possibility of the EU also coordinating. The Pope said recently in a TV interview that countries of destination should establish a threshold for welcoming migrants and that the EU could come together to, this sort of agreement to coordinate. So I just wanted to know what you think, with all this information, with the experience of the past few years, why that isn't happening and what more could be done, and could other actors or players try to encourage that on an EU level?
Yeah. Well, I think what Pope Francis was trying to put together in a rather sort of synthetic way in that interview is that he is, first of all, he's applauding the efforts being made by the EU. He's encouraging the EU to greater unity and to greater clarity in terms of how you deal with and how you share the burden. And the Holy See, for example, has always been very strong in its sustenance of the southern European members of the EU, who are very often under extreme pressure. And he's also seeing, and I think this is something which has developed in his thought as he's been thinking through the whole question of migration, he does see now that the question of welcoming and receiving people has to be accompanied by a very, very clear idea of how you're going to integrate people into the society. And I think that's what he's getting at there. Because the idea that you can, receive somebody, you can sort of like process them in whatever way is deemed legal and appropriate, and then sort of just say, well, that's that. You're on your own now. I think that is a danger in many countries, and then that creates creates a situation that people who are already very fragile, have had very negative experiences in the whole process, they then become extremely vulnerable as well and open to exploitation within society. So I think that's what the Pope's getting at. Yeah.
Thank you very much. If there are any particular questions or comments, insights, we'd be delighted to hear them. Please, yes.
Let me abuse my position both as a speaker but also as a discussant. Two remarks I wanted to make. First, on the question of the messages to our partners. The Grand Chancellor is right that there is a certain fog, to put it mildly, around the messages that we project. But this is precisely because we haven't yet managed, our member states haven't yet managed to find this big European agreement on our pact proposals that we have presented 2 years ago. So it's a bit unfair that this lack of agreement is projected as the end of the story. It's not. This is how European democracy works. Elmar Brok has been a member of the European Parliament for decades. It takes time. So bear with us. We will get there. And I agree, for as long as we don't have this agreement, this is a pull factor. Because the smuggling networks, the traffickers, they go through our cracks. They think they can, their business model prevails. The moment that we have this big agreement, I'm sure that the loopholes will close. So not yet there, but we will get there. Second point on integration, which is a very important point that His Eminence raised. There, I think one needs to be very clear that this is a two-way street. The European Union will deploy everything we have in terms of competence, resources, and tools to make sure that these people are fully integrated into our education systems, to our job markets, into our health and housing systems. This is the European way of life. That's what defines us as Europeans. It cannot be done otherwise. But at the same time, these people will also have to respect the model of society we represent and we stand for, the values on which we abide, the role of women in the family, in society, and the workplace, the need for religious tolerance and peaceful coexistence. If they don't do their part, integration will not happen.
Thank you very much. I want to pick up that point about integration, and perhaps, Grand Chancellor, I can come to you, because you referenced the experience of receiving migrants and refugees to Germany. Because there are clearly points that are about legality, and it's clear this is criminal behavior, this is unacceptable behavior. But then there are gray zones where it is cultural, it is about integration. How do you navigate that?
I think for the first generations, or for those who came, it's very important that when they come, they will have lessons, just information about the culture of their country, of the country where they came into. Most of them at this stage are very open to learn. And then to follow up, we have thousands of volunteers which are called immigration pilots. They follow families, and when they went out of the receiving centers, to help them to get into the job market, with the bureaucracy and so on. So it takes a lot of effort. But it's interesting to see, also taking the example of Germany, that the perception of migrants is much more positive where migrants are than in the parts of the countries where there are less migrants. So it shows that the person-to-person experience takes away perception. Let me take another remark, coming back to you, to people leaving the country. I think we have to learn also from the past. Last century, the migration from Italy to the United States, I think at the end was very positive for the United States and for Italy. And Cardinal Tagle once said we shouldn't talk only of brain drain, we should talk of brain circulation. So we should see this as a positive factor of bringing people and countries together. Of course, it needs assistance and help, as you mentioned, in the countries of origin, of course. But we should look at these positive effects too. And again, if we see look at the demographic development in Europe, we need migration. And recent polls in Europe and in Germany show that people are more and more aware of this factor, and therefore looking at the phenomenon with a more positive way. So I think there's no reason for desperation, but we have to drive the car forward and not loosen our intention to it. And I think, why couldn't we do more? A concrete idea. We need a lot of healthcare workers, nurses in Europe. Why not establishing education in countries, in Africa and other countries, say that a certain percentage of those educated there, also with language courses, can come to Europe, of which a certain percentage can stay and a certain percentage has to go back. And then perhaps a part of the salary is only paid when they go back. So I think we have to have inventive ideas how to manage the migration. And I think the population, as soon as they get the impression that the migration is managed and not suffered, the perception will turn to be more positive.
Thank you very much. I feel like you want to also comment, Ms. De Mayo, but I wanted to ask you specifically about the issue of data that you raised. Now, of course, all of us here have shared a lot of data about ourselves to get here, not only for travel, but of course with COVID. And so part of the problems that some receiving countries had is to actually collect data. And now, of course, that data is being handled for health reasons, but also can be used. From your experience, I mean, how much of that data can be used in a positive way, but also how much of it could potentially be a breach of privacy for those who are arriving?
Sure, okay. So first of all, from the data perspective, our research shows that there is not presently enough coordination and sharing of data. So you have law enforcement, you have migration authorities, and you have security forces, and we don't have the data to be able to really analyze, for example, the threats, if there are terrorist threats, if there is criminal threats, because we don't have that integration of the data. Now, the point that you're raising is a slightly different one. Yes, we always have concerns about the use of private data. This isn't something new. This is something that human rights lawyers are concerned about all the time, and there are plenty of models that we can look at how we can protect personal private data, but still make sanitized versions of data available for the analysis that we really need in order to be making data-driven decisions. So there's multiple layers of data. You don't have to disclose everything about the person in order to be able to use the data. UNICRI is also very involved in looking at how emerging technologies and artificial intelligence can be used, how both it can support law enforcement, but also how law enforcement can use the technology in order to thwart the bad guys. This is definitely an emerging area, very interesting, very complicated, but I think we can start to look at how technology can also help us with this issue. The last thing I wanted to mention is that, and it's a different perspective on data, which is, again, the point that we need to be doing more research into some of the nuanced issues. Now, some of the emerging issues that we see right now, for example, on security and migration, is what will be the impact of the crisis of Afghanistan, what will be the impact on the neighboring countries of Afghanistan, what will be the impact on any potential migration flows that come from Afghanistan. This is something we have to look at very carefully. The second one is what's happening with climate security. We haven't really touched upon that yet, but climate security is a major driver of movements of people. And we do see in our research a relationship, and very important in particular contexts to look into that more detail. We're looking right now at the impact of climate insecurity, food insecurity in the Sahel, and how that's driving movements of people across Africa and eventually then into Europe. But there's many of these nuanced areas and different aspects of data that I would really encourage all of us to get more involved in because they're really important to this question.
Thank you. Any questions or comments from the audience before I carry on with my questions? Please, there's just a mic coming for you. If you wouldn't mind, please introducing yourself.
Thank you very much. My name is Alice Mondirito, and I am Special Advisor on the Prevention of Genocide, United Nations. And mine is a comment of an observation that we often treat migration issues as issues of people trying to get into Europe. And so therefore, that then means that we don't focus more on migrations going on all over the world. Thinking about my continent of birth, Africa, that the borders are very porous. By the time people try to get to Europe, they've tried to get to many other countries. And I know, of course, that there are all these dramatic scenes of people drowning at sea, and that fuels this whole debate about migrations in Europe. But we don't have the photographs of people who die in the Sahara, like moving from one country to another. And I would think that if we are talking about migration and migration policies, so important to also have discussions with what are other countries doing about migration in the Middle East, in Africa. What are they doing to manage issues of migration? Are there lessons learned that can be borrowed from Europe? Are there lessons learned that can be borrowed from Africa? And can there then be a global approach to the issue of migration, and an approach that makes everyone feel connected, that this is an issue that everybody has to deal with? Because I can tell you from the perspective of my mandate that migration continues to be a huge risk factor, especially in consideration of how easy it is through these porous borders for small arms and light weapons to move from one point to the other through this kind of movements. So thank you very much. Thank you for this session.
Thank you, I appreciate that. Your point about exploitation, but also that lessons learned, I mean, brings me to the part of the discussion that talks about what are tangible measures, and I think your suggestion of education, and then finding the skill sets of what is needed in Europe or in other parts of the world is a great one. But if we can try to focus our minds here on the panel of what one change you'd like to see in the international system to allow for better migration when it comes from a security perspective. And of course, we've seen at the UN, there was the high-level summit on migration and refugees. There's been a lot of talk about this and the thinking about it, but how can we go into the very tangible? So Archbishop Gallagher, I want to start with you, and if you could give us one takeaway or one particular action that you would advocate for.
Okay. If you'll allow me, I'll group a few things together, but I think the intention is one. We've heard quite a lot this morning about corruption in that dimension. I would like to see more progress made in confronting trafficking, both in the Mediterranean and elsewhere, holding people responsible for their actions, and also understanding better how people are trafficked in one way. It remains a slightly mysterious thing which is symbolized in the boat crossing the Mediterranean, but what lies behind that? I think we need to understand it in order to combat it better. And finally, I think also to combat the general thing, we need more regular and legal migration systems set up, of which there is access to those procedures, and which are done in such a way that in allowing legal and regular, actually, you do not deprive necessarily the countries of origin of the talent and the person power that is necessary to build that country up. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Mayo.
Great, thank you. It's probably not going to come as a surprise that I'm going to say policies have to be data-driven, not fear-driven. Too many of them are fear-driven, and those policies have to have the human at the center, human rights-based, rule of law, extremely important, and justice. If you don't have policies based on those three, they're not going to be effective.
Thank you very much. And some more tangible suggestions from you.
I think we have perhaps to differentiate between the reasons for migration. If we look for cases of refugees, for instance, we have very positive examples in Uganda. Many refugees from South Sudan have been settled very successfully in Uganda, and they contribute to the GDP in Uganda in a significant way in the meantime. So when it deals with refugees, people displaced, we should do more efforts to settle them in the neighborhood. I think that's very important. And the model of refugee camps, which has developed after the crisis at the Great Lakes in Africa, now has become really dramatic. The medium stay in these camps is more than 12 to 15 years, and the time is prolonged by the year. So more efforts have to be done to resettle refugees in neighboring countries, knowing that probably they will not be able to return quickly. I agree with your remarks. I think the migration in Africa from sub-Saharan Africa to the south is even bigger in number than to the north because of the difficulties to cross the Sahara and the Mediterranean. So the phenomenon has to be looked at in a greater scope. And again, I want to underline what Monsignor Gallagher said. I think we have to create more ways of legal migration based on bilateral agreements with the states of origin, committing them to take back those who are not coming legally, but to offer a greater number of legal migration. I think that would be a great achievement if this could be agreed with on bilateral agreements.
Thank you very much. Archbishop Gallagher, I wanted to go back to your comment about your visit to Lebanon and to pick up on the point about camps. I mean, we have Palestinian refugees that have been living in camps, and the camps became cities in the Middle East, and there are other examples, again, when it comes in other parts of the world. And so the question is, your takeaway of that, of saying it's an unsustainable situation, from what you've seen in Lebanon, but also we fear that climate realities are going to push more people out in the coming decades. What can be done when there isn't the political will to raise the level of immigrants coming in legally for resettlement?
If you've got it's a very difficult question. I must admit that you've posed there. I think we have to sort of insist on creating political will, because as I think I said earlier, that this phenomenon, and as other people have witnessed as well, is not going to go away. This is part of the reality of our world today, as it was the reality of the world of the past, and it will be part of the reality of the world of the future. And climate change is going to be one of the reasons, political turmoil in very many parts of the world, and we have got to face up to these challenges. It is, unfortunately, very often the domestic politics make it very difficult for the politicians to face some of these issues. And this is where I think we have to say that it shouldn't be, we have to encourage everybody to try and face these problems together. This is where we need to reinforce our multilateral dimension, where we have to have regional and continental cooperation and face these problems together. So therefore, I think that maybe if we're doing it at that sort of supranational level, that eventually will give confidence to maybe countries that are hesitating, who are or unwilling to receive migrants and refugees. But the thing is that you can't build a castle and think that we are not going to be affected by this. I think you certainly will eventually be affected by it. And as has happened sometimes, eventually the body politic in a particular part of the world may find itself in need of these things. So all this has to be, I think, taken together. But I don't think we should surrender because there is a lack of political will at this particular moment. I think we have to persevere and we have to work together in a very positive manner. Thank you.
Thank you. There's a question here.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Alvise Giustiniani, and I work for Philip Morris International. And I'm responsible for the fight against illicit trade. And so I can see a lot of connections with the organized crime and smuggling our products, but smuggling also people, just like a normal commodity. I have two questions. One is, I was back, I think it was December 2018 in Marrakesh, where the UN launched the Global Compact for safe and regular migration. So I just wonder, it's only 3 years have gone by, but do we see some positive outcome from that, some good momentum? And the second question is more close to home, to Europe. I appreciate the fact that Europe, there are a lot of countries and democracy takes time to make its way, which is some way a good thing. Just wonder, is there some good examples of a country? I just throw it there, maybe Sweden, which happens to be the home country of the current Home Affairs Commissioner, Ylva Johnson. Or is Sweden a bit too high up there as a standard for all Europe to be at the same level? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, so Mr. Mayor, I'll ask you to address the first question, and if you wouldn't mind taking the second question.
Great, thank you for the question. I'm not exactly the right one to speak directly to the Global Compact on Migration because of the entity that I'm here representing, but I do want to say that we are part of the Global Program on Counterterrorism, which has also been a fairly new program. And I think that's one where we do see real results. We see massive cooperation across the United Nations. We see growing interest from a large number of member states and really nuanced, evidence-based initiatives that are being taken to counter terrorism. And a lot of the research that we're currently doing right now is on these intersection points between migration and terrorism, or between the nexus between organized crime and terrorism. You see these relationships in various different aspects across the spectrum, yeah? And so I think that, of course, as always, when actors come together with a common aim, and they work together from their various perspectives, we're able to see results, and we certainly see that in the fight against terrorism.
Rather than projecting a model of a certain member state as a model for the rest, in our pact proposals, we presented a holistic framework for a European migration and asylum policy, which I like to describe as a three-story building. The first floor is what I was discussing earlier, the relations with countries of origin and transit, the external dimension of migration policy. The second floor has to be border management and border procedures. We cannot delegate this responsibility only to the frontline member states without a certain system for European federal management of our borders and our procedures in the border. And the third floor is solidarity and burden sharing, so that the family of 27 shares equally the responsibility. So this is a building that has to have the same resilience in all three floors. There are certain member states that prefer the third floor, but there can be no third floor without the first and the second, and others that are very happy with the first and the second, but they don't want to move up at the third. So our model is that all these three floors would have to be decided at the same time, have the same resilience, and give a certain predictability both within and beyond the union.
Thank you very much.
Regarding the Global Compact, you probably know that it is currently under revision at the UN, and the first experiences are gathered to see how it can be further developed. My observation is that while there was high political tensions about it during the conference in Marrakesh, and some states slipped out at the last moment, the perception now is better, because countries make the experience that cooperation has merits, and countries understand that this compact is not only in the interest of furthering migration, it's in the interest of all countries, of the countries of origin, of transit, and of reception. So I think the development since Marrakesh is all in all positive.
Thank you very much. Well, with that, we're coming close to ending the session. And really the discussion points that we've heard so far today show not only the complexity, which I'm sure you're all very well aware of, but also that there are positive elements that we can build upon, and that the experience particularly of the last decade should be utilized, both in terms of experiences, but in terms of perceptions, that unfortunately at the moment are not being, and in large part because there isn't enough political will, but that shouldn't be an excuse. Rather, it should be a galvanizer. Archbishop Gallagher, I know you're closing out the session. Those are the directives I've been given, so I will hand over to you. And I want to thank you all for being here for this very important topic, and of course, to thank the Sovereign Order of Malta for bringing us together with MSC to have this conversation. So over to you.
Thank you very much. I immediately ask people's indulgence, because whenever you make one of these summaries, it's like thanking people at the end of an event. You always leave something out, and I'll probably leave out some point which somebody here thinks is absolutely vital. But I'll just give a few pointers of things that have struck me as being I think the point which was made about the necessity to work from data and facts is fundamental, because there is a lot of fear, as was pointed out, and there are a lot of myths about migration which we need to challenge. The second point which I'd like to make is to do with what we perceive and what we look from, whatever our religious or ideological or philosophical position might be. When we look towards a migrant and refugees, do we really respect the dignity of that human person? And I think that is fundamental, and we have to sort of repeat that. And that has to find, I think, expression, and it's to our advantage that it do so in a very positive reception of migrants, knowing what we've heard about how this conditions their behavior. They have every right to a positive reception, but it does make probably things easier for their future and for their future integration within society. We've talked a lot about the EU, but I think out of that there came a desire that we need to strengthen across the board partnerships at every level to confront the phenomenon of migration and to deal with it in a very humane and a very positive way during the future. More legal migration came through on certain speakers and in the interventions. I repeat what I said a little bit earlier about corruption, which I think we do have to continue to confront. And finally, I think there was a corrective given to us in some ways. We did talk a little bit about the Middle East, but we should not forget, as the Grand Chancellor was saying, and as was from the floor was mentioned, that migration is a universal phenomenon. And we shouldn't forget about Africa. We shouldn't forget about Asia, and certainly not Latin America at this time, remembering the problems of El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala, migrating through Mexico to the United States. And then, of course, we've got the enormous challenge to the whole of Latin America of migration from Venezuela because of the political crisis there. So anyway, I hope I haven't done too much injustice to this very profitable exchange that we've had this afternoon.
Thank you so much. Grand Chancellor, would you like to say anything before we close?
I would just thank everybody for taking part in this discussion, and hope you will have a good continuation of the conference here in Munich. Thank you very much.